So yes, I think it is in our human nature to want to know what the future holds. And generally, what we want the future to hold is something good. So it just struck me now, we say fortune cookies or telling one's fortune. Even that expression presumes that the future will be fortunate, right? So when we hear something with which we disagree or something unpleasant, of course, maybe our first instinct is not to take it at face value. But every culture, every mythological system today and for ages has this special person that has the gift of seeing into the future. And often a person like that might become a leader in their community, but again, for as long as they tell the community perhaps partly what the community wants to hear. So in Greek mythology, for example, there was a princess called Cassandra, and she had the gift of prophecy, but she was also cursed with that no one would ever believe what she said. And one of the things she said was predicting the Trojan horse. That's how Troy fell, is when people snuck in with this giant wooden horse. And she predicted that, but because she was cursed, no one heard her. And in the Bible, similarly, prophets, yes, they did speak about the future as well as about the present. And they were also quite often not believed. But their primary role still, as we discussed earlier, was really more to speak God's word into the present and to allow people to see the contrast, like in the mirror, between what was happening and what God's ideal for them was. It's a little bit like in French, the word for a preacher is actually, it sounds like a predictor, but that's not the preacher's role. The preacher's role is to proclaim, not to predict anything. And that's because the Latin root for that word actually is the one who proclaims. And so prophets, preachers, teachers, people who genuinely hear God's voice speak to them, and I believe that's not just the special persons, the leaders in the community, it's all of us. We are the ones who are tasked with discernment. Discernment underlies today's story that Sophia reluctantly read for us. It's the story of the prophet who ended up being a false prophet versus Jeremiah. And that story was set at a challenging time in the history of Israel, right as the exile happened. So we heard about the Babylonian exile, right? That the elites and prominent citizens and the royalty from Jerusalem were taken captive. But how did that come about? This happened around 600 BC. And that's when the story that we just read is set. What happened is there was king, so there was actually a sequence of kings, and one of them was Josiah. And the kings kind of alternated between those who were kind of like the true prophets to their people, the ones who kept renewing the nation's commitment to God, and listened to the prophets, the voices who spoke God's message. And then the next one might come and he would be pandering to the secular political powers because a lot was going on around the little nation of Israel, little in the grand scheme of things, even though it was quite prominent in its own day. So what happens here around 600 BC is that Josiah has a series of reforms that renew Israel's commitment to God, but then he dies in battle. And right around the same time, Assyria that had just conquered the northern part of the previously unified kingdom of Israel, begins to weaken. Egypt, another prominent force, sees that weakening and wants to fill the void, wants to take a chance to rise. Babylon, however, defeats Egypt. And once Egypt falls, Judah, which is the remaining part of the kingdom of Israel not yet conquered by Assyria, Judah becomes kind of a vassal state, a state manipulated and ruled by Babylon through a puppet king in Jerusalem. And for a while, though, the city still stands. Most importantly, the temple of God still stands. And so people have the hope that perhaps they can shake off the influence of Babylon, the control over them, and they rebel under the next king, whose name was Jehoiakim. And that rebellion kind of brings the end. Jerusalem is under a siege. The temple now is sacked. The treasures are stolen. The sacred vessels, the special items of ritual significance are gone. And the exiles now are taken captive and taken away to Babylon. Still, there is always the hope. There is always somebody who says, all of this will get better soon. And so this prophet Hananiah, of whom we heard in our reading today, says, in 2 years, this will get better. Everyone's going to come back. The treasures will be returned. Can you blame the people for wanting to hear something like that? Not only it's a message of peace and restoration, but it's also what a faithful person wants to hear, that the temple worship will come back, that you'll be able to be in a relationship with God like before. We generally want things to be like they were before. But Jeremiah, so the story appears in the book of Jeremiah, and Jeremiah is the one who is the opponent of Hananiah here. Interestingly enough, Jeremiah doesn't immediately go and say, this is just fake news, like, false. He doesn't engage in an outright debate right away. He actually acknowledges that, may the Lord really do this. It's a very human response. He effectively says, I really wish what you were saying is true. So he shares the people's hope. He wants the same thing as everybody for his country, but he reminds people that only because the message is hopeful, patriotic, maybe even aligned with your religious hopes and beliefs, it doesn't mean that it will really be what happens in the future. And Jeremiah, being a prophet himself, talks not only about the future, but about today. His message was that what is happening politically with Babylon, invasion and exile and conquest, is meant to tell people that their political expectations are misplaced, that they are starting to turn away from God and rely on their strength, that the idolatry, injustice, false worship is prevalent. And in Jeremiah's opinion, Babylon is, what's happening through Babylon is a judgment being enacted on the people, not really only as a punishment, but also as a wake-up call for them to reevaluate once again their relationship with the true God. But he does say, I just wish, Hananiah, what you were saying was true. And so perhaps the question is not who is the true prophet here. The question is, how do you know? And also, what prophecies are we hoping for? Clearly, here, people were hoping for what Hananiah was saying. But what about us? I think we can tell who the possibly false prophets are, and it's usually the people with whom we disagree. So the politicians on the other side, media outlets we distrust, influencers on the media, on social media, who say absolutely outrageous, unsubstantiated claims. So those people, they might actually be false or not false, but we immediately dismiss them as false because it's not what we want to hear. Now, the actual false prophets are the ones, actually most often the ones with whom we naturally agree, because we want to hear that message. And that was that Hananiah's message of peace. In our culture, who are the voices that tell us what we want to hear? And what is it that we want to hear? Yesterday, over dinner, I gathered with a few people, and we were talking about artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, those platforms, the tools that can be actually very helpful in, let's say, editing your work. But the thing with ChatGPT is that if you wanted to help you, say, improve your writing or your work that you've prepared, if you just plug it into the tool, it's going to say it's brilliant. And it's just built that way, probably because it reflects who built it, and that's people. So the artificial intelligence is only going to mirror what its creators put into it. And it seems that they have placed this bias into the system that it will always praise you as a default. So you can actually get amazing help from ChatGPT, but you have to tell it to tell you the truth. So as long as you instruct it to do that, then you'll be good. But otherwise, the default is praise. So that's one thing, perhaps one example of such voices that we like to hear. What about politicians who promise quick solutions? Every political campaign is based on basically promising something that's may or may not be attainable, but certainly will not be as quickly attainable as they generally say. What about advertising? Always saying that, again, the whole premise of advertising is that you're currently lacking something, but with one click, with one purchase, your joy will be complete. What about the diet industries? And any kind of, even gym industries or weight loss or fashion industry that prey on our lack of contentment with our bodies, with the way we look or feel, perhaps, or move. Psychological self-help books that always seem to promise the results. Let's say parenting books always tell you we are the ones. If, like, you know, everybody else is wrong, but if you just do what we say, your child will be golden. Don't you want that? So we tend to believe these things readily. So basically everything, or a lot of the messaging today is cloaked in this sophisticated, authoritative language that is, first of all, sounds authoritative, and second, generally tells you what you want to hear. Of course, not every confident voice is false. So how do we tell the difference? Again, how does discernment work in today's world? Well, one thing to say is that, first of all, prophets might not look or sound as whom we would consider stereotypically prophetic. So they might not actually have the best credentials or education level, or speak like we do, or be of the same background or age. They might not be the old sages. They might be the children who have the best insights that completely interrupt the flow of my thought process for a children's message and then make it better. It might be people who show up at our door or at the little pantry who need our help, but in return might offer a completely different perspective than what we have. It might be people approaching the end of life because they have, again, an entirely different outlook on the remaining time that we might have. So the prophets might not look and sound as what we expect a sage to look like. And they might not even say anything at all. They might speak through their actions. They might be the ones bringing a meal or simply sitting with you in a challenging time, or even sending a card. It might be either their action or even their presence that might speak louder than anybody's words or promises. And Jesus, in today's gospel, turns it around, and he says a prophet might actually be the one who needs your hospitality rather than gives you something. And so I have a poem here on the cover. It talks about Christ coming as various needy people to a person who was like a prophet in that he expected Christ's arrival. So he somehow heard in his mind that Christ is coming today. So he's sitting at home waiting. And in the meantime, a bunch of people come who need his help. And at the end of the day, he says, God, why didn't you come? And Jesus says, actually, I did. It was in the form of those people. So you can read this poem later on, but it speaks to the idea that we hear through the Gospels, that when you help, when you offer hospitality, when you hear a person, their message with sincerity, with the receptivity, in a way you offer hospitality that way as well, through listening and maybe through some practical help, you might be receiving a prophet, or you might be receiving Christ himself. Or it might actually be the same thing, because the image of God lives in all of us, and it's through the image of God that we speak prophetic messages to each other. So to tell if a prophet is not false, if the prophet is true, the measuring stick is the Bible, the scripture. If what we hear is in line with what we know to be God's desire for us, then I would say the chances are that prophet speaks the truth. If we hear words that speak to our own desire for ourselves, which is generally for control, certainty, then that message is likely false. If it's not in line with God's character, and if it's not in line with God's expectations for us, then that message is false. And lastly, I would say what struck me recently is that the most pervasive false message of our time is that we are not enough. So what I said earlier about advertisement and all sorts of industries that are trying either to sell you something or to improve you somehow. There is this general trend for self-improvement in every possible way. Well, I would say this is the false message of our day, that everybody needs improvement, but the improvement is the superficial way of looking better or appearing better or being fitter or smaller, but not so much being closer to God or living more charitably and truthfully. So again, whenever we hear such messages, let us continue to evaluate, discern, align what we hear with what we know, and support each other in that process, and be the true prophets who speak the words of truth to each other, not to the kings, not to the great crowds, just to the people in immediate circles with whom we interact daily, speaking the truth gently, in love, but truth nonetheless. Thanks be to God.